A wealthy family's dark secrets lead to a deadly confrontation. This is the true story of betrayal and murder. Connor Whitaker had it all. A successful real estate mogul with a thriving empire, his luxurious home in the heart of the city was a symbol of his wealth and success. He was a man of vision, known for making bold moves in the business world. His family, in turn, was seen as the perfect reflection of his accomplishments. His wife, Anna, was beautiful, elegant, and sharp, a woman who always seemed to have her finger on the pulse of the city's high society. Their two children, Josiah and Alice, appeared to live lives of privilege, with every opportunity at their disposal. However, beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect family, there was a constant undercurrent of tension. The Whitakers were no strangers to conflict, and as the years went by, the cracks in their relationships began to show. Anna, despite her outward calm, had become increasingly dissatisfied with the pace at which Connor was growing their fortune. While Connor had built a vast real estate empire, making cautious, strategic decisions, Anna had grown frustrated with what she saw as missed opportunities. She wanted more properties, more expansion, more power. Connor, on the other hand, had always been a careful man, someone who believed in steady, sustainable growth. He feared taking risks that could jeopardize everything he had worked for. But Anna's relentless ambition began to wear him down. He knew that she wanted control, and he wasn't sure how far she was willing to go to get it. Their arguments, once rare, now became more frequent. Conversations that began with a discussion about a property deal would spiral into heated exchanges about the future of their family's business. Anna was convinced that the time to expand was now, while Connor remained steadfast in his belief that they needed to protect what they had, to avoid the kind of reckless decisions that could lead to ruin. They would often fight late into the night, their voices echoing through the halls of their mansion, but neither would back down. Josiah, their teenage son, found himself caught in the middle of his parents' growing war. A troubled and rebellious young man, Josiah had always felt the pressure of living up to his father's high expectations. He had never been interested in business, preferring the thrill of a fast lifestyle. Parties, alcohol, and reckless behavior had become his way of coping with the tension at home. His relationship with his father was strained, as Connor was constantly disappointed by his lack of ambition and focus. Josiah resented the pressure, and as the arguments between his parents intensified, so did his own rebellious behavior. Alice, their college-aged daughter, was quieter, more observant. She didn't get involved in the conflicts, but she noticed the changes in her family. She saw how her mother's once charming smile had turned into something more calculating, more determined. She noticed the cold distance that was growing between her parents. Alice tried to keep the peace, hoping that somehow things would settle down, but deep down she knew that the cracks in the family were growing wider by the day. The tipping point came one evening when Connor made a bold announcement at dinner he was planning to sell part of his real estate portfolio to a rival competitor. The move was a calculated decision to secure the family's future, but Anna was furious. To her, it felt like a betrayal. She didn't understand why her husband was unwilling to take risks to ensure the family's legacy. She saw this as a sign of weakness, a refusal to embrace the opportunities that were right in front of them. The argument that followed was like no other, filled with accusations, hurtful words, and a growing realization that the family was no longer united. Anna's frustration and Connor's caution had reached an impasse. For the first time, it seemed like there might be no way forward for them as a family. The tension between Connor and Anna reached a boiling point after the announcement about the sale of part of the business. That evening, as the dinner table was cleared, Anna's anger simmered just below the surface. She had spent the past few weeks building her own vision for the future of the Whitaker family, one where they expanded aggressively, capitalizing on new markets and opportunities. Connor's cautious approach, his refusal to take risks, seemed to her like an unwillingness to seize the full potential of their wealth. The argument that night began quietly, but it quickly escalated as Anna's frustration broke free. She accused Connor of being too afraid to embrace the future. of standing in the way of their success. Connor, taken aback by the intensity of her response, tried to explain that selling parts of the business was a strategic move to safeguard their fortune, not a sign of weakness. But Anna was beyond reasoning. To her, the decision felt like a betrayal of her ideas, her ambitions, and the promise she had made to herself long before they had ever built their empire. As the evening wore on, the argument became louder, filled with bitter accusations and deep-seated resentment. Connor tried to maintain his composure, but his calm demeanor only seemed to infuriate Anna further. She felt ignored, dismissed, and worse, trapped in a marriage where her own dreams were being stifled. It wasn't just the business that she was fighting for, it was the control she wanted over her own life and future. Meanwhile, Josiah, who had been in his room upstairs, overheard the growing argument. He had never fully understood the complexities of his parents' relationship, but now, as the shouting grew louder, he realized how deeply things had deteriorated. Josiah had always resented his father's expectations and the pressure that came with them. His father's focus on the business, his never-ending work ethic, and the lack of attention Josiah had received had driven a wedge between them. But as he listened to his mother's voice break through the house, Josiah began to feel something stir inside him, a deep sense of anger and frustration at his father for what seemed like his refusal to let his family truly thrive. Josiah's frustrations with his father had built up over the years, and this was the moment when everything felt justified. He couldn't stand the way Connor controlled everything, from the business to his personal life. Josiah had always seen his father's cautious nature as a barrier to what he truly wanted: freedom. If his father wasn't willing to take risks, if he wasn't willing to go all in, then maybe it was time to take matters into his own hands. Downstairs, the fight between Anna and Connor intensified. Anna, feeling cornered, began to speak of other options, other people who could help her achieve what she wanted. She mentioned a businessman who had been making waves in the same industry, someone who had the boldness and vision that Connor lacked. She had already been meeting with him, planning out a future where she took control, where she could truly make her mark. Connor was stunned by the revelation. His suspicions about Anna's growing discontent were now confirmed, but he couldn't believe the extent of her secretive actions. He tried to reason with her, telling her that betraying the family's legacy for her own ambition would only bring ruin, but Anna was too far gone. She had made up her mind. In the days that followed, Anna's meetings with the rival businessman became more frequent. She quietly arranged deals, made plans, and laid the groundwork for what she saw as a necessary revolution for the family. But what Anna didn't realize was that her actions were pushing the family closer to the edge. She thought she was in control, but the more she maneuvered, the more fragile everything became. The family she once thought would stand by her was beginning to fracture, each member pulling in a different direction. Josiah, feeling more alienated than ever, began to align himself with his mother's drive, thinking that perhaps this new venture was the only way he could escape the expectations that had bound him for so long. Meanwhile, Alice, ever the observer, began to see just how much damage was being done. She had tried to maintain peace, but she could no longer ignore the growing distance between her parents, nor the secrecy that now dominated their lives. As the days wore on, the Whitaker family found themselves caught in a dangerous web of ambition, betrayal, and unspoken resentment. Each move they made only brought them closer to the inevitable, yet none of them could foresee just how much their fractured bonds would cost them in the end. As the days passed, the Whitaker household grew more fragmented. The once vibrant and bustling home now felt colder, the walls seemingly echoing with the tension that filled the air. Anna's secretive meetings with the rival businessman became more frequent, and she was increasingly distant. Connor, though he tried to act as if everything was normal, could feel the distance growing between them. He could see it in her eyes, the way she looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and disdain. What had once been an unspoken understanding between them had now been replaced by a growing chasm of mistrust. Despite his suspicions, Connor refused to believe that Anna would go so far as to betray him and the family. He had always trusted her, and the thought that she would be conspiring behind his back seemed impossible. Yet, every time he walked into their home, he could feel the weight of something unspoken, something dark hanging over their lives. It was as if he was now living in a house of lies, surrounded by the very people he had built everything for, but who were no longer on his side. Josiah, meanwhile, had become even more volatile. His rebellious streak, once confined to his own life, had now turned against his father. He had begun to see Anna's side of things, convinced that Connor's caution was the reason why the family wasn't growing the way it should. Josiah was angry at his father for failing to take risks, for keeping the family in what he saw as a gilded cage. He had always felt like the black sheep, never meeting his father's expectations, and now, with Anna's encouragement, he felt validated in his disdain. The more Josiah listened to his mother, the more he began to see her ambition as something he could get behind. After all, wasn't this the way forward? Wasn't it time for the Whitaker family to step out of Connor's shadow and into a new future? He felt like he could taste it, the power, the money, the freedom. Anna's whispers of a new business venture, of a bigger world beyond their current success, ignited something in him. He felt that for the first time he could escape his father's grip and make something of himself. But Alice saw everything unraveling with a sense of helplessness. As much as she tried to stay out of it, she couldn't ignore the changes taking place in the household. The once tight-knit family was falling apart, and she knew that the foundation they had built together was crumbling beneath them. She could no longer pretend that everything was fine. Her mother, once the loving and supportive figure, now seemed cold and calculating. Her father, always the calm and collected businessman, was now lost in a storm of suspicion and hurt. Alice had always tried to stay neutral, to be the peacemaker between her parents, but now she was beginning to see just how far her mother was willing to go. She discovered, by accident, some of the documents Anna had been secretly keeping: contracts, plans, and notes that clearly outlined her dealings with the rival businessman. Alice felt a sense of betrayal wash over her. How could her mother be so blind to the consequences of her actions? The Whitaker family, once a beacon of success, was now caught in a dangerous web of greed and deceit. Alice considered telling her father what she had found, but she hesitated. She didn't know what good it would do. Connor was already hurt, already suspicious. Exposing Anna's betrayal could push them even further apart, and Alice wasn't sure that their family could withstand any more destruction. Her silence, however, would soon be its own burden. As the days passed, Alice's sense of dread grew. She could feel the walls closing in on her family, and no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, the truth was undeniable. Her mother had crossed a line, and there was no turning back now. The fragile balance of their lives was about to shatter, and nothing would be the same after that. Josiah, too, was reaching a breaking point. He had long ago given up on trying to please his father, but now, with Anna's encouragement, he saw a way out of the suffocating life he had been trapped in. The path ahead seemed clear. But what Josiah didn't realize was that his own choices, influenced by his mother's ambition, would soon lead him down a dangerous road that none of them could have predicted. The growing conflict between his parents had already set the stage for a tragedy that would change the Whitaker family forever. As the weeks wore on, the tension within the Whitaker household became unbearable. Connor, still trying to keep the family business intact, continued to pour himself into his work, but his mind was constantly occupied by thoughts of his wife's growing distance. Anna, ever more determined, kept up her secretive dealings with the rival businessman. She had begun to plan the takeover, believing it was the only way to secure her future, but she failed to see how dangerous her actions had become. Each day, as her ambitions grew, so did the risk of everything falling apart. Josiah, who had been alienated from his father for so long, found himself increasingly aligned with his mother's vision. He no longer saw his rebellion as something meaningless, but as a means to an end. If his mother succeeded, so would he. He had always resented the pressure to live up to his father's expectations, but now he realized that he didn't need to live in Connor's shadow. Anna was offering him a chance at something more. She began to confide in him about her plans, drawing him further into her world of secret meetings and ambitious schemes. Josiah felt validated in a way he never had before. The promise of power, of control over his future, was intoxicating. But Alice, though still trying to keep her family together, grew more and more disillusioned. She could feel the darkness closing in on them. She knew that her mother's actions were leading them down a dangerous path, but she also knew that there was no stopping it. Anna was too far gone, too determined to win. Her loyalty to the family, to her father, had been replaced by a cold ambition. Alice had always been the one to see the good in people, to try and hold everything together, but now she couldn't help but feel that everything was slipping through her fingers. The Whitaker family's escalating tensions came to a tragic and violent conclusion one fateful evening. Connor, weary from the constant battles with Anna and the relentless pressure to keep his family together, made a final attempt to resolve the conflict. He returned home early, his mind racing with thoughts of salvaging the remains of his once thriving household. Anna, meanwhile, had spent the day consumed by her frustrations. Her resentment toward Connor had grown insurmountable, fueled by years of perceived slights and his refusal to support her ambitions. She viewed his recent decisions as a betrayal, and by the time Connor entered the house, her anger had reached a boiling point. The confrontation began almost immediately. What started as a tense exchange of words quickly escalated into a shouting match, with neither willing to back down. Years of suppressed bitterness came pouring out, each blaming the other for the family's collapse. The air was thick with rage and despair, the echoes of their argument reverberating through the house. As the shouting intensified, Alice and Josiah arrived home separately, drawn to the chaos unfolding in the living room. Alice hesitated at the edge of the room, her heart sinking at the sight of her parents locked in yet another battle. Josiah, on the other hand, stormed into the fray, his own anger ignited by the scene before him. The room became a storm of accusations and recriminations, with Anna and Connor at the center. Anna's fury reached a breaking point as she grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter. In a moment of unrestrained rage, she lashed out, plunging the blade into Connor's chest. The room fell silent as Connor stumbled back, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with shock. He collapsed to the floor, the life draining from him as blood pooled beneath him. Anna stood frozen, the knife still in her hand, as the enormity of her actions sank in. Alice screamed, breaking the silence, while Josiah stood paralyzed, unable to process what had just occurred. The man who had built an empire and fought tirelessly to protect his family was now lying lifeless on the floor, the victim of a moment of unbridled fury. Panic set in as Anna dropped the knife, her hands trembling. She tried to stop the bleeding, but it was too late. Connor's injuries were fatal, and he succumbed within minutes. The weight of her actions crushed her as she realized there was no undoing what had been done. The aftermath was devastating. Anna was arrested and charged with murder, her ambition and rage leading to the destruction of the family she had once fought to support. Josiah and Alice were left grappling with the loss of their father and the shocking reality of their mother's actions. The Whitaker family, once a symbol of success and power, was now irreparably broken. Connor's tragic death became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how unchecked ambition and unresolved tensions can lead to unimaginable consequences. The suburban neighborhood that had once admired the Whitakers now whispered of their downfall, a chilling story of betrayal, anger, and the devastating cost of fractured relationships.